November 12th, 1944. Dawn broke pale and cold over the rolling farmland of Wisconsin. Frost clung to the fences of Camp McCoy, each barb catching the light like glass. Inside the wire, more than 3,000 Japanese prisoners of war stirred from their bunks, the sound of boots and coughing filling the wooden barracks. They had once fought for the Empire under the burning Pacific sun. Now they lived in a place where the cold cut sharper than any bayonet. Lieutenant Masao Fujimoto wrapped his blanket tighter as the guard's whistle shrieked. He had survived the sinking of his destroyer in the Marianas, endured capture, and crossed the ocean in chains. But nothing had prepared him for this strange captivity: clean beds, hot food, and guards who spoke without hatred. That morning, as the prisoners filed out for work detail, a sound reached them that made Fujimoto pause. At first, it was like the fluttering of sparrows beyond the wire, light, quick, almost musical. His men craned their necks, uncertain. Then the figures emerged. Not soldiers, not wardens, women. They carried clipboards, baskets of supplies, trays of bread still steaming in the cold. Their laughter drifted across the yard, unguarded and warm. The Japanese prisoners froze in silence. These were not the gaunt peasant women of Manchuria or the haggard faces of Okinawan refugees they had seen in war. These were young, healthy, confident Americans, their hair tied back beneath kerchiefs, their cheeks flushed pink from the cold. For men who had been taught that the enemy was brutal and monstrous, the sight was disarming to the point of pain. Fujimoto heard one of his sailors mutter under his breath, almost in disbelief. "They send angels to watch us?" But they were not angels. They were nurses, clerks, Red Cross volunteers, women whose duty was to keep order in the camp, to tend wounds, to hand out bread, to keep life running. And yet, to the prisoners, starved of softness, it felt like encountering an entirely different species of power. Not rifles, not bombs, something subtler, more dangerous to their discipline. What shook them was not just the presence of women. It was their beauty. The war had taught these men to expect cruelty, to believe in sacrifice and suffering. Now they faced something else, a reminder of a life they no longer had, and perhaps would never have again. And in that moment, as frost cracked beneath their boots and laughter drifted through the barbed wire, the prisoners of Japan realized that America's supremacy was not only measured in rifles and bombers. It was here, too, in a kind of human abundance they had never imagined. The cold lingered even as the sun climbed higher, melting frost from the fence posts and rooftops. Masao Fujimoto moved with his work detail toward the mess hall, hands tucked into his sleeves, his eyes drawn again to the figures across the yard. The women worked briskly, carrying trays, writing lists, handing out rations with the same efficiency he had once admired in naval officers. But there was something else that unsettled him more than discipline. It was the way they smiled. Not every prisoner stared. Many forced their eyes down, lips tight, clinging to the mask of silence drilled into them by the imperial code. To look too long was to admit weakness, yet silence betrayed little when hearts thudded in every chest. The camp was filled with the rustle of whispers, even among men who once prided themselves on stoicism. Corporal Nishida, a farmer's son from Shikoku, muttered just loud enough for Fujimoto to hear, "They are brighter than the sun we knew in Saipan." He shook his head, ashamed by his own words, as though beauty itself were treason. Later, as they sat in the mess hall, steaming bowls of stew set before them, the sound of laughter rang again. Fujimoto turned to see one of the women, tall, with auburn hair catching the light like flame, bend down to check on a prisoner with a bandaged hand. She asked him something in English, too fast to be understood, and the man blinked as though stunned, nodding mutely. She smiled anyway, a gesture that needed no translation. The man sat motionless, long after she left, spoon untouched. When pressed by his comrades, he whispered, "I thought I had forgotten the face of a woman, but I remembered it again." The men around him laughed nervously, but there was no cruelty in it. Each of them understood. They had been stripped of so much weapons, uniforms, homeland. But here, stripped further of hardness, they realized what the war had stolen most completely: the ordinary presence of women. For Fujimoto, the revelation came days later. His work detail was assigned to stack lumber near the infirmary. The air was sharp with pine resin as they carried planks across the yard. As they passed, a young woman leaned out of the infirmary doorway, a scarf tied over her hair, her sleeves rolled back. She called to one of the guards, her voice carrying like a bell across the yard. Fujimoto glanced up only a moment, but the image seared itself into him. Her face, open and unafraid, utterly different from the gaunt shadows he had seen clinging to life in ruined Manila. She laughed at something the guard said. For the first time since his capture, Fujimoto felt not humiliation nor bitterness, but an ache that cut deeper. That night the barracks hummed with talk. The younger sailors compared the women to film stars they had once seen in Tokyo cinemas before the war. Others whispered that it was a trick, a weapon subtler than bombs. "They want us to envy them," one man insisted, his voice sharp, his pride refusing to bend. "They show us this so that we feel our weakness." But not all were convinced. Another prisoner, a former teacher, shook his head. "No, this is not strategy. This is America. They live with such abundance that even here, in a place for prisoners, they give more than we have known." The words stung. For years, Fujimoto had believed in the divine destiny of the empire, that Japan's spirit outweighed American material power. Yet here, the evidence of supremacy was not steel or fire. It was the effortless grace of women who walked unarmed through a camp of men who had once sworn to die killing them. Weeks passed. The women became part of the rhythm of camp life. They distributed supplies, tended wounds, checked records, sometimes even taught English classes for prisoners who volunteered. Their presence remained electrifying, yet it also became strangely normal. Men began to shave more carefully, to straighten their clothing before roll call. Some, embarrassed by their own roughness, kept to themselves, but others stood taller, as though reminding the world that they had once been officers, men of standing. Fujimoto noticed it most in Nishida. The farmer's son, who had once trudged through work detail with dull eyes, now sang softly under his breath as he stacked firewood. He seemed to carry himself differently, as though remembering he was human, not just a prisoner. One afternoon, as Fujimoto's group was dismissed from work, they passed near the canteen. Two women stood outside, their heads bent together in conversation, one holding a basket of bread. As the prisoners walked by, one of the women looked up. Her gaze fell directly on Fujimoto. For an instant, it was unbearable. Her eyes held no fear, no contempt, not even pity, only curiosity, as though she were seeing him not as a soldier, not as an enemy, but as a man. He looked away quickly, shame burning his face. Yet that moment clung to him through the night, a ghost of warmth that returned each time he closed his eyes. The transformation spread through the camp like a quiet tide. Men who had once clung only to duty now found themselves whispering about hair, the color of wheat, about hands that smelled faintly of soap and bread, about voices soft enough to slice through the silence of captivity. It was dangerous not because the guards forbade it, but because it threatened to unravel the discipline that bound them together. For months, these men had endured captivity by hardening their hearts. Now, a smile, a glance, a laugh undid what bayonets and bombs could not. Fujimoto sensed it clearly. The empire had trained them to fight until death, to resist with steel and silence. Yet here, in this place far from battlefields, America defeated them with something gentler, more merciless, not violence, life itself. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as frost gathered again on the barbed wire, Fujimoto realized that beauty, something he had once dismissed as weakness, had become the sharpest weapon in his captivity. The frost had given way to mud. Spring seeped slowly into the camp, turning the hard ground soft beneath boots and soaking the wooden barracks with damp air. The days lengthened. The light stretched further into evening, and with it the rhythms of captivity shifted. What had once been a monotony of work details and roll calls now carried a new undercurrent, subtle but inescapable: anticipation. For many men, it came with the clang of the mess hall bell, when they knew the women would appear to ladle out food. For others, it was the moment when records were checked and lists were taken when they caught a glimpse of hair tied back in scarves or hands scribbling names in neat English script. There was no need to speak of it aloud anymore. Everyone knew. The women had become part of the prisoners' daily calculations, as essential to the routine as the guards' whistles or the morning count, not because of what they did, though their work was vital, but because of what they represented. They were a reminder that the world outside of war still existed, and that it was impossibly different from the one these men had known. Masao Fujimoto felt it keenly the day he was assigned to mend fences along the camp perimeter. The work was grueling. Posts sunk deep into half-frozen ground. Barbed wire stretched taut. Gloves stiff with cold. He and 5 others worked under the eyes of guards, hammers ringing as they drove nails into wood. But every so often, movement caught his attention from across the yard. One of the women he had learned, her name was Margaret, though he never dared say it aloud, carried papers between the infirmary and the command office. Her scarf flapped in the wind, her stride quick and assured. Each time she passed, the men straightened unconsciously, even those too proud to admit it. A guard noticed and barked a laugh, shaking his head as if to say, "Even now, you fools are the same as all men." That night, the barracks buzzed. The younger sailors argued over details: the shade of her hair, whether her eyes were blue or green, how tall she stood compared to the others. It was childish, almost ridiculous, yet no one could entirely resist. In a place stripped bare of everything human, the simplest fragments of femininity became treasures. But beneath the surface, a darker current swirled. Not every prisoner embraced this new obsession. Some feared it. Lieutenant Okabe, the senior officer in Fujimoto's barracks, stood one evening and spoke with a firmness that silenced the chatter. "Remember who you are," he said. "We are soldiers of the Emperor. These women are not here for us. They are our captor's tools. Do not disgrace yourselves by longing for the enemy's kindness." The men listened, heads bowed. Duty demanded it. Yet when the lights dimmed and silence returned, Fujimoto heard the restless shifting of bodies, the muffled sighs of men caught between pride and longing. The words of their lieutenant weighed heavily, but the images of the women weighed more. The conflict deepened weeks later, when the camp announced English lessons for any prisoner willing to attend. It was not mandatory, but the guards hinted that those who participated might receive privileges, better work assignments, extra rations, even a chance to write letters home. Curiosity burned through the camp. And when the men learned that 2 of the women would help teach, the decision became unavoidable. On the first day, the classroom filled quickly, wooden benches creaking beneath the weight of men who had once sworn never to yield to American ways. They sat stiffly, hands folded, faces stern. Yet the moment the women entered, carrying chalk and notebooks, the atmosphere shifted. Silence grew heavy, broken only by the scratch of chalk as one of them wrote the alphabet on the board. Fujimoto sat near the back, his jaw set. He told himself he was there, only to observe, not to participate. But as the lesson began, letters pronounced slowly, words repeated with patience, something disarmed him. The women smiled, not mockingly, not with triumph, but with genuine encouragement. When a man stumbled over a word, they did not laugh. They nodded, urged him on, coaxing the sound from his mouth until the room echoed with hesitant English syllables. The prisoners looked at one another, almost bewildered. They were men trained to believe in mercy as weakness, in the enemy as a monster without face or heart. Yet here the enemy leaned forward gently, correcting pronunciation, repeating patiently, their hands gesturing, their voices soft. By the 3rd lesson, something astonishing happened. Laughter. It began with Nishida, the farmer's son, who mispronounced bread so badly that even he could not suppress a grin. The woman teaching, not Margaret but another, shorter with dark hair pinned neatly, laughed too, not cruelly but warmly. The sound rippled through the room. And for the first time in months, the prisoners allowed themselves to laugh as well. It was dangerous laughter. Dangerous because it reminded them of home, of family, of the very humanity war had buried. Dangerous because it pierced the armor of pride that was supposed to shield them. And yet, it was irresistible. Fujimoto resisted longer than most. Each night, he told himself that he must remain vigilant, that this was all manipulation. But each day he found himself repeating words under his breath, testing the strange English sounds, listening for the cadence of the women's voices. One afternoon, as the class ended, Margaret gathered papers from the desks. When she reached Fujimoto's row, he kept his eyes down, determined not to look. Yet as she passed, a piece of paper slipped from her pile and fluttered to the floor beside him. He bent instinctively to pick it up. Their hands touched for the briefest instant as he returned it. It was nothing a second, less than a second, yet it left his heart pounding so violently he could not hear the dismissal bell. That night he lay awake, replaying the moment endlessly, furious at himself for weakness and yet unable to will it away. The barracks changed. Men began practicing English quietly in corners, testing words with one another. Some spoke of the women not just as captors, but as teachers, even benefactors. Pride clashed with longing, duty with desire. And through it all, the presence of the women grew heavier, their influence undeniable. The guards noticed too. They watched with smirks, sometimes with warnings. But even they could not entirely conceal their amusement at the spectacle. Hardened Japanese soldiers, once feared across the Pacific, now blushing like schoolboys when addressed by a smiling American nurse. One evening, Fujimoto overheard two guards speaking outside the barracks, their voices low but clear through the thin wooden walls. "Funny, isn't it?" one said. "We break them not with bullets, but with kindness. They don't know what to do with it." The other chuckled. "Better than barbed wire. A smile keeps them more docile than any rifle." The words seared Fujimoto. Was that what he had become? A man undone not by defeat in battle, but by the gentleness of women? Rage burned in him, directed not at the guards, nor even the women, but at himself. He had been raised to fight to the death, to resist even in chains. And yet here he was, clutching at the memory of a hand brushing his, of a smile meant for no one in particular. He told himself it was humiliation. But in the silence of night, he knew it was something else, something more dangerous. Because for the first time since his capture, he had begun to hope. Summer came to Wisconsin like an ambush. One day the fields outside the wire were still soft and damp from spring rains, and the next they shimmered with heat, cicadas droning in the tall grass. The camp smelled of cut hay and sweat, and the men found themselves rolling up sleeves, wiping brows, laboring beneath a sun not so different from the one they had known on islands far across the Pacific. But unlike those islands, here the enemy did not fall from the sky in bombs or come charging with bayonets. Here the enemy appeared in light dresses and sun hats, carrying clipboards and baskets of bread. For many of the prisoners, this season changed everything. Winter had been shock, spring had been adjustment, but summer was temptation. And temptation thrived in small details. A loose strand of hair caught by the wind, the sound of a laugh across the yard, the sight of hands adjusting papers on a desk. Things they had not seen in years, not in the brutal isolation of the war, not in the company of men stacked together in steel hulls or dug into jungles. It was during those long summer days that the camp's officers realized the danger was not escape, but erosion of discipline, of spirit, of the iron pride they had sworn to keep unbroken. Lieutenant Okabe grew stricter, barking orders in the barracks, scolding men for lingering too long during lessons or for watching too closely during meal lines. He reminded them of home, of wives and mothers waiting across the sea, of the Emperor's eyes upon them even here. His words carried weight, but each time Fujimoto saw the flicker of doubt in the younger men's eyes. They nodded, they obeyed, but when evening came, their whispers turned back to the same subjects. What did she say? Did she look at me? Did you hear her laugh? The women had become ghosts in their thoughts, presences lingering even when absent. One afternoon, Fujimoto was assigned to the infirmary garden, pulling weeds and carrying water under guard. It was quiet work, sweat running into his eyes as he bent over the earth. Then a shadow fell across him. He looked up. Margaret stood there. a wicker basket of herbs in her hands. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The guard leaned against the fence nearby, half bored, half amused. Margaret crouched, her skirt brushing the dirt, and pointed at a row of plants. "Meant," she said slowly, in English. Then, with careful precision, she repeated the word again, nodding toward him. Fujimoto blinked, his throat dry. The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. At last, he forced his mouth to shape the sound. "Mint," he repeated, his accent rough. Her smile broke like sudden sunlight. She nodded, pleased, and for that single instant, Fujimoto felt the weight of months lift. It was nothing more than a word, but it carried the intimacy of acknowledgement. She had seen him, heard him, taught him. That night, he told no one. Some things were too fragile to share. Others, however, were not so discreet. By July, rumors swirled through the barracks of men who had managed small exchanges, a prisoner who received an extra piece of bread with a wink, another who dared to say thank you in English and was rewarded with a smile. Each story grew in the telling, until some whispered of secret notes, of glances that meant more than they should. Whether true or not, it was enough to unsettle the officers. Okabe called a meeting, his voice sharp with fury. "Do you not see? This is their weapon. They use kindness as chains. You disgrace yourselves with every thought, every look. You are samurai no longer. You are children, dazzled by shadows." But even as he spoke, his own eyes betrayed unease. He was not blind. He had seen the way his men straightened when the women passed, the way silence fell heavier in their absence than in their presence. He fought not just his men's weakness, but his own. The Americans noticed as well. Captain Harris, who oversaw the camp, wrote in his log one evening, "The women keep order more effectively than the MPs. The Japs behave better in their presence. Strange, but useful. Will continue." And so the women remained, moving through the camp with their baskets and clipboards, their laughter floating like a reminder of a world untouched by war. To the Americans, it was a practical arrangement. To the Japanese, it was a torment and a gift. The tension broke one stifling afternoon when a prisoner named Mori collapsed in the yard, overcome by heat. Guards shouted, men scrambled, and within moments one of the women, Anna, the one with dark hair, was kneeling beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, murmuring words none of them understood. The prisoners stood frozen, watching. They had seen comrades fall in battle and be left to die. They had seen wounds ignored, suffering treated as weakness. But here, the enemy knelt in the dust, tending a man who hours before had been just another number in a hostile ledger. Fujimoto saw tears streak down Mori's face as he whispered over and over, "Why? Why?" The question lingered long after Mori recovered. Why kindness? Why care? Why beauty in a place meant for humiliation? That night, as the men whispered, Fujimoto remained silent, staring at the rafters above. He thought of Margaret's smile, of Anna's hands pressing cloth to a fevered brow, of the warmth in voices that should have been cold. He felt torn between worlds, one of loyalty, pride, unyielding resistance, and another of humanity, fragile, dangerous, irresistible. He understood, with a clarity that terrified him, that America's power was not just in its rifles or its bombers. It was in this abundance, this confidence, this ability to show mercy without fear. To men who had been taught that mercy was weakness, it felt like a weapon more devastating than any blade. By August, the barracks had divided. Some clung fiercely to discipline, repeating Okabe's words, holding tight to the emperor's ghost. Others surrendered quietly, practicing English phrases late into the night, treasuring every accidental touch, every fleeting smile. Between them lay an unspoken truth. None of them would leave the camp unchanged. For Fujimoto, the change was already complete. Though he did not admit it aloud, he no longer dreamed of battles or victories. He dreamed of voices, of words, of the curve of letters written on chalkboards, of the scent of mint leaves crushed between fingers. He dreamed, most dangerously of all, of life beyond the barbed wire. And in those dreams, he was not an officer of the Imperial Navy. He was simply a man, listening to a woman's laughter on a summer afternoon, wondering if it might ever belong to him. The cicadas faded with the summer. By September, the Wisconsin nights grew cooler again, carrying with them the scent of harvest fields outside the wire. Leaves browned on the distant trees, a reminder that another winter would come soon, another cycle of confinement. Yet inside the camp, something had already changed so profoundly that no returning frost could undo it. The prisoners were not the same men who had first stumbled ashore in chains, clutching the last fragments of their defiance. War had trained them to endure steel and fire, to resist until death. But war had not prepared them for what they had found here. Bread that arrived still warm, voices that spoke without hatred, women whose laughter unsettled their very idea of what strength was. Lieutenant Masao Fujimoto felt the weight of it more than most. Each day he told himself that he would reclaim his iron pride, that he would block out the sound of the women's voices, their smiles, their gestures of kindness. And each day he failed. The memory of Margaret crouched in the garden with a sprig of mint, the light in her eyes when he pronounced the word, haunted him with more persistence than any nightmare of sinking ships or gunfire. His fellow prisoners sensed it too. They had begun, dangerously, to treat the women not as enemy functionaries, but as human beings, even as symbols of something they longed for, but could not admit aloud. English phrases became common in the barracks. At first they were practiced shyly, haltingly. By autumn, men whispered them like charms in the night, fragments of a new language stitched into the silence. Thank you, bread, water, good morning. Simple words, yet each carried weight enough to bend a soldier's pride. And so the rift deepened. Lieutenant Okabe grew harsher with each passing week. He lectured, he punished, he ordered men to remember who they were. Yet even as he thundered about shame and disgrace, the younger prisoners exchanged knowing looks. They did not mock him. None dared, but they had already begun to drift beyond his reach. Discipline could command their bodies. It could not command their thoughts. It was a small thing that finally cracked the wall. One late afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the yard, a group of prisoners returned from work detail to find the women unloading crates near the mess hall. The guards directed the prisoners to assist, tossing instructions in English. Most of the men stood frozen, unsure, unwilling to risk breaking code. But one, a 19-year-old sailor named Kenji, stepped forward. He lifted a crate, his jaw clenched, and muttered in halting English, "Heavy." One of the women, Anna, the dark-haired one, smiled at him, as if he had spoken perfectly. "Yes, heavy," she repeated, her tone light, encouraging. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence. Kenji flushed, but his hands did not tremble. The crate thudded onto the pile, and when he straightened, Anna offered a quiet, "Thank you." It was nothing, a single word exchanged across language and culture, and yet it carried the weight of a cannon blast. For in that moment, every man watching felt the unspoken truth. The wall between them and the enemy was no longer impenetrable. It was porous, fragile, breached. Okabe raged that night, calling Kenji a disgrace, threatening punishment. But his fury fell flat. Too many men had seen. Too many men had felt the ripple of that small act. A door had opened, and no shouting could close it. Fujimoto lay awake long after the lights dimmed, staring at the beams of the barrack ceiling. He thought of Kenji's trembling voice, of Anna's answering smile, of the way silence had fallen heavier in that moment than in 100 roll calls. He thought of the paper Margaret had dropped months before, of their hands brushing, of the way his heart had pounded as if he had fought a battle alone. And for the first time, he allowed himself to admit what had gnawed at him all these months. He no longer knew what it meant to be the enemy. Weeks passed, the leaves fell, and still the women came. Their presence had become routine, but routine had not dulled its effect. If anything, it had sharpened it, like a blade honed daily against stone. The men no longer whispered only about glances and smiles. They whispered about the future. Could there be life after this? Could they return to Japan unchanged, carrying within them the memory of women who had shown them kindness when the world had told them to expect only cruelty? Would they even be welcome if they admitted such thoughts? Fujimoto asked himself those questions each dawn as he stood in line, the barbed wire gleaming with frost behind him. Pride said one thing, memory said another. The war had taught him to believe in absolutes, loyalty or betrayal, strength or weakness, victory or death. But captivity had revealed a third path, one he had never imagined: survival with humanity intact. The lesson reached its quiet climax in November, on a morning when frost returned to the fences and steam curled from mugs of coffee in the women's hands. Fujimoto was assigned once again to the infirmary garden, though by then the earth was bare, the plants withered by the cold. Margaret was there, her scarf wrapped tightly, her breath clouding in the air. She greeted him with a nod, then bent to pluck the last remaining herb stalks from the soil. Fujimoto hesitated, then, with a steadying breath, spoke in English. "Mint." She looked up, surprised, then smiled that same smile he had carried in his memory for months. "Yes, mint," she answered softly. For the first time, he did not look away. It was nothing more than a word, shared in the brittle air of a prison yard. Yet in that word lay everything: defeat, survival, humanity, hope. When he returned to the barracks that evening, he said nothing of it. Some things were too fragile for words, but he carried the moment with him, a private proof that even in chains he remained human. The war would end months later. The prisoners would eventually be shipped home, stepping once more onto Japanese soil as shadows of the men they had once been. Many would never speak of what they had seen, what they had felt, what they had dared to think inside those American fences. But some carried memories not of battlefields or bombardments, but of the faces of women who had smiled at them, taught them words, handed them bread still warm. Memories that cut deeper than any rifle, because they revealed something no officer's speech, no emperor's decree, no uniformed guard could ever erase. That even in captivity, even in defeat, they had glimpsed a kind of beauty and kindness they had never expected from the enemy. And that glimpse would haunt them far longer than the war itself.